The light through the curtain had gone the deep orange of late afternoon before Albert Finch opened his eyes at all, and for a moment he lay still and let the room tell him what hour it was, the way he had taught himself to do these 11 years. 3:30, or near enough. He knew it by the particular slant of sun across the wallpaper, by the sound of Mrs. Cutler's mangle turning next door, by the smell of someone's early supper of onions starting up 2 houses along. The bed was warm where Nell had been, and was warm still where he lay, and for a moment he did not move, only breathed in the smell of the room. Coal ash from the grate gone cold in the night, a whisper of yesterday's washing soda, the particular Swedish must of the horsehair mattress that had been his mother's before it was his. He was 34 years old and had lit the lamps of Islington for 11 of those years, and his body had long since given up the argument about what hour a man ought to sleep in and what hour he ought to wake. He slept from the small hours of the morning through to mid-afternoon, same as a night watchman or a baker or any of the other trades that kept the city running while respectable people slumbered, and he had grown to love this stretch of afternoon light more than he had ever loved a morning, because it belonged entirely to him before the work began. Downstairs, he could hear Ivy's voice, high and quick, arguing some small point with her brother, and the clank of the kettle being set on the hob, and under it all the steady thump hiss of Nell working the mangle in the scullery, wringing the wet out of someone else's linen for 2pence the basket. He lay a moment longer, listening to his own house living without him, and then he swung his legs out from under the blanket and set his feet on the cold boards and began, as he did every day, to come back into himself. The room was small. It was one of 2 they rented in the narrow terraced house on Wenlock Row, off the city road, with the Hobsons below and the Cutlers through the wall. But it was theirs, in the way that mattered, arranged just so. The washstand under the window, where the light was best for shaving. The children's truckle bed folded against the far wall for daytime. A print of the old Queen, pinned up crooked, because Sammy had knocked it once reaching for a moth. Albert poured water from the ewer into the basin, and it was cold enough to wake the last of the sleep out of him, and he scrubbed his face and the back of his neck, and felt the stubble of 2 days under his palm, and decided, as he generally did, that Thursday's beard could wait for Thursday's razor. He dressed in his shirt and his moleskin trousers and his waistcoat, the ordinary clothes of the daylight hours, because the uniform proper, the heavy dark coat with its brass buttons, the peaked cap with a company's badge, stayed at the depot on Britannia Row, and he would not put it on until he signed the book at 5:30. There was a comfort in that plain shirt and waistcoat, in being for a few hours yet simply a man in his own house, and not yet the lamplighter the street knew him as. He went down the narrow stair with his boots in his hand, the wood cool and worn smooth under his stockinged feet, each tread announcing him with its own particular creak, 7th from the top, the loudest, and he did not mind it, for it meant Ivy heard him coming and was already turning from the table with her face lit up. "Father's up," she said unnecessarily to the room, and Nell looked round from the scullery doorway with a strand of hair come loose and stuck to her damp forehead, and gave him the smile she kept, he sometimes thought, only for this particular hour of the day, the hour when he first came down. "There's tea made," she said, "and I've got the chop on for you, only give it a minute yet." He sat at the table, which was the only table, doing service for eating and for Sammy's slate work and for whatever mending Nell had in hand of an evening, and Sammy, 8 years old, all elbows and questions, pushed a battered tin soldier across the wood toward him in some silent offering of company, and Albert took it up and turned it in his fingers and admired it gravely before setting it back down. Ivy, 5, climbed half onto his knee before he had properly sat, and he let her, working one arm round her while he reached for the cup Nell set before him. The tea was strong and dark, stewed the way he liked it, and he drank it black, because sugar was a Sunday extravagance, and milk turned in hot weather quicker than they liked to risk, and the first mouthful of it, scalding, did more to wake him than the cold water had. Bread and dripping came next, while the chop finished. Good beef, dripping, the jellied brown salt at the bottom of the basin spread thick, and he ate 2 slices, standing at the window, looking down into the yard, where a line of someone's washing hung gray-white and heavy, unmoving in the still autumn air. It was the second week of October, 1895, and the afternoon had that particular quality London kept for itself in autumn, a light gone thin and gold and slightly smoked, as though the sun itself had picked up a little of the city's soot on its way down through the sky. There would be a mist later. He could feel it already in the stillness, in the way sound carried oddly from the yard. A dog 2 gardens off, a coalman's cry from the next street, each noise arriving very clear and very separate, the way sounds do when the air has started to thicken toward evening. Nell brought the chop to the table with a boiled potato and a spoon of pickled cabbage from the jar, and Albert sat down properly to it, this being, as it was every day, his dinner and his day's chief meal both, eaten at 3:30 in the afternoon, while other households were only thinking of tea. He had grown used to eating out of step with the street. It no longer struck him as strange, though it had once in his first year on the round, when he had sat down to meat and potatoes at tea-time, while the smell of other families' dinners drifted past the window hours too early or too late by his own clock. "Tanner says there's a new man starting on the Canonbury beat," Nell said, sitting across from him with her own cup, her hands, red from the mangle water, wrapped round it for warmth. "Come down from Bedford, so Mrs. Tanner says. Left a wife and 3 up there for now till he's settled." "Barlow's beat, that'll be," Albert said. "Barlow's gone up in the world. Inspector now, or near enough." He cut into the chop. "Good beat, Canonbury. Quieter than mine. Is yours not quiet?" "Quiet enough." He did not say more, because there was not much more to say. The round was the round. 82 lamps between the Angel and the top of Duncan Terrace, walked at the same brisk practised pace 6 evenings in 7. And quiet was exactly the word for it, though it was a rich sort of quiet, full of small things, that he did not know how to explain to a woman who had never walked it. He had tried once in their first year married to describe to her the particular look of Colebrook Row with the lamps coming up one after another down its length, and had given it up as a thing better shown than told, except that she could never be shown it, her own hours running the opposite way to his. Sammy had abandoned his tin soldier and come to lean against his father's arm, and Albert, without breaking off eating, put a hand on the boy's head, feeling the fine hair under his palm, warm from the fire. "Can I come on the round Saturday?" Sammy said. It was not really a question. He asked it most weeks. "If your mother says you may, and if you can keep up," and if you don't go touching the pole." This last with a mock severity, because the boy had once at 6 got hold of the lighting pole left leaning by the door and very nearly had the taper end of it in the coal scuttle before Albert caught him. "I'm 8 now. You are that?" Albert finished the chop and mopped the last of the fat with his bread and sat back, and for a few minutes more allowed himself simply to be a man in a warm kitchen with his family round him, the fire ticking in the grate, Nell gathering the plates, Ivy singing something tuneless and private to her rag doll on the floor, the light outside sliding by slow degrees from gold toward gray. This was the best part of his day, he sometimes thought, though he would never have said so where the men from the depot might hear it. Not the lighting, which he loved in its way, nor the walking of the dark streets, which he loved in another way again, but this hour at the table, eaten out of step with the rest of London, before the uniform went on and the night began. By 4, he was pulling on his boots by the door, and by 1:30 he had his coat over his arm, not the company coat that waited at the depot, but his own old topcoat against the walk there. And Nell was seeing him to the step with Ivy on her hip, the child waving one small fist in a solemn good-bye she had learned from watching her mother do the same. "Mind you eat something at Peggotty's stall if it's a long night," Nell said, which she said most evenings, as though the words themselves were part of the ritual of his leaving. And Albert kissed her cheek, which tasted faintly of the soda from the washing, and told her he would, and stepped down into the street, where the mist he had felt coming was already beginning to soften the far end of Wenlock Row into something gentler and less certain than it had been an hour before. The walk to the depot took him the better part of 20 minutes, down past the ironmonger's with its shutters half drawn, along the city road, where the traffic still ran thick, vans and cabs and a great slow beer dray from the brewery, its horse's breath showing faint in the cooling air, the whole street loud with iron tires on stone and the cries of a man selling the evening paper on the corner by the chapel. Albert kept to his own pace through it, neither hurrying nor dawdling, a man walking a road he had walked some 4,000 times and no longer needed to look at to know. He knew which flagstone stood proud and would catch a careless boot, knew the particular corner by the pickle factory where the smell of vinegar hung thick enough to taste, knew the exact spot by the old horse trough where the noise of the city road fell away behind a turning and the quieter streets of his own beat began. The depot on Britannia Row was a low brick yard behind wooden gates, smelling always and everywhere of tar and naphtha and the particular cold mineral smell of gas itself, a smell Albert had stopped noticing years ago, except when he came fresh to it from the street, as now, and it struck him for a moment the way it must strike a stranger, sharpish, faintly sweet, not unpleasant once a man was used to calling it the smell of his trade. Along one wall stood the racks of poles, 40 or 50 of them upright, like a thin leafless copse, each 8 or 9 feet of ash wood, tipped with its small mechanism, the hook to work the tap at the top, and above that the little wick holder that would carry a flame up to the mantel. Men were coming and going about the yard in the last of the daylight, some pulling on the dark coats from the store cupboard, some bent over the ledger where old Hobden the timekeeper sat with his spectacles pushed down his nose, taking each man's name as he passed. Finch. Hobden did not look up, only found the line and made his mark, the same as he had every evening for 11 years, and Albert said, "Evening, Mr. Hobden," the same as he had every evening for 11 years, and went to the coat store. The company coat was heavy, dark green, gone near enough to black with age and smoke, with its row of brass buttons stamped with the gas company's mark, and it had molded itself over the years to the particular set of Albert's shoulders, so that putting it on now felt less like dressing and more like a kind of returning, the weight of it settling into place the way a well-worn tool sits into a familiar grip. The cap went on after, peak low against the mist that would thicken as the night wore on, and then he crossed to the rack and took down his own pole, not truly his own, the company's, but marked at the collar with a scratched AF that he had put there himself in his second year, so that no other man's hands need fumble with a taper trimmed to someone else's habit. He tested the little valve hook with his thumb, out of habit rather than need, for he had checked it not 6 hours before at the end of the last watch, and found it, as he always found it, sound. Then he took up his taper can from the shelf, the small reservoir of oil that fed the flame at the pole's tip, that would burn steady through the whole long round without need of relighting, and struck it going, cupping the flame a moment in his palm against the faint stir of air in the yard, and felt the small satisfaction he always felt at that first flame, the one that would carry fire, borrowed and multiplied 82 times over, down every street of his beat before the night was out. Other men were assembling too. Tom Yardley, who had the beat running up toward Cannonberry Road, was strapping his own pole's leather sling across his shoulder and complaining without much heat about the state of lamp 41 on his round, whose glass had gone cracked in last week's frost and not yet been replaced. Old Ruddock, who must have been 50 if he was a day and had lit lamps in this same yard since before the mains were properly laid on gas at all in some of these streets, sat on the mounting block, lacing his boots with the slow, deliberate care of a man who had learned long ago that haste in this trade only led to trouble later in the night. A dropped glass, a fumbled ladder, small mishaps easily avoided by a man who did not rush. "Fine night for it," Ruddock said to no one and everyone, tipping his face up to where the sky showed gray gold between the depot roofs. "Mist'll sit low. Good for the gas, that. Burns prettier in a bit of a haze." "You always say that," Yardley said. "I always mean it." Albert said little, being by nature a quieter man than either of them, but he liked this part of the evening, the yard full of low talk and the smell of tar, the last light going out of the sky above the roof line, the sense of some 40 or 50 men all about to walk out into the city on the same errand at once, each to his own particular streets, each carrying the same small stubborn flame. There was a fellowship in it that did not need much saying. He had stood in this yard on the night Ivy was born, and on the night Nell's sister was married, and the other men had known, without much being said, exactly what quiet nod or word of good cheer was wanted and given it, and gone on to their own beats after, because the lamps did not wait on any man's news. By 5:10 he was through the gate and out onto Britannia Row with the pole balanced easy across his shoulder, its small flame guarded down at his side, walking north toward the top of his beat, where it began, by the old chapel wall on Duncan Terrace. The mist Ruddock had promised was thickening now in earnest, not the thick choking sort that came in November and made a man's eyes sting, but a softer, kinder version of it, autumn's own mist, blurring the far ends of streets into gray and carrying with it the smell of coal smoke from 10,000 kitchen fires being built up for the evening, and under that, fainter, The green, wet smell of the plane trees along the terrace dropping their leaves onto the pavement. The light was going now in earnest, that hour the almanac called civil twilight, and Albert simply called his hour, when the sky held just enough gray-blue left in it to see by. But the shop fronts had begun lighting their own windows, small, warm squares appearing one by one down the street ahead of him, like a kind of rehearsal for what he was about to do himself. He reached the first lamp-post of his round, number 1, though he had never once in 11 years thought of it by its number, thinking of it instead as the lamp by the chapel wall, the way he thought of every lamp on the beat by the house or shop or tree that stood near it, 82 small landmarks that together made up the only map of London he had ever needed to carry in his head. He set his feet, the old practiced stance, 1 foot a little forward, and raised the pole. The hook found the little lever at the top of the standard by long habit rather than sight, and he opened the gas with a small definite motion of the wrist, felt rather than heard the soft hiss begin above him, and brought the taper's small flame up to meet it. There was always the smallest pause, half a second less, in which nothing happened at all, the gas finding itself, and then the mantle caught with a soft, ghostly plop and bloomed all at once into that particular clean white gold light that Albert had never in 11 years stopped thinking beautiful, however many thousand times he had made it happen with his own hand. He lowered the pole and stood a moment, as he always allowed himself to for the first lamp of the night, and looked up at it, burning steady above him in the thickening mist, a small warm planet come down to hang just above the chapel wall, and then he turned and walked on to the second. The rhythm of it took him over quickly, as it always did, a kind of walking meditation that had no need of thought once his body remembered it. 40 paces or 50 between posts, the pole coming up, the small definite motion, the pause, the bloom of light, the pole coming down, the walk on. He did not count the lamps as he went. He had long since stopped needing to, but he knew without counting when he had done a dozen by the particular turn onto Colebrook Row, where the houses stood taller and better kept, with their black railings and their scrubbed steps, and where Mrs. Adderley's cat, a great marmalade Tom with one ear chewed ragged from some quarrel long forgotten, sat waiting for him most evenings on the second gatepost, as though the lighting of the lamp above were a small entertainment laid on for its private benefit. "Evening?" Albert said to it, as he said most evenings, and the cat blinked its slow yellow-eyed blink and did not move, and he lit the lamp above it and walked on, and behind him he heard, or imagined he heard, the faint creak of the cat resettling itself for the long watch of its own. Colebrook Row ran long and handsome under its new light, one lamp catching after another all down its length until, looking back from its far end as he sometimes did, Albert could see the whole street laid out in a chain of small gold fires receding into the mist behind him, each one his own doing, each one exactly like the last, and yet somehow, taken all together, a thing he never quite tired of seeing. Windows were lighting now too along the row, gaslight, and here and there the softer flicker of a candle in a nursery window, and once he caught the smell of a good coal fire drawing well, and once the high clear sound of someone practicing scales on a piano, badly, over and over, the same 4 notes. He crossed by Duncan Street, where the traffic still ran, though thinner now, a hansom cab going by fast with its lamps lit and its wheels loud on the wet stone, and he touched his cap to the driver, who he did not know but who touched his own hat, back out of the simple courtesy of men working the same streets at the same hour, and went on. By the corner of Essex Road, he came on young Constable Prewitt, standing in the mouth of an alley, with his cape drawn close, working through the slow, deliberate progress of a man walking his own beat, and the two of them stopped, as they generally did for a minute's talk, being, in a sense, colleagues of the night, though in different trades entirely. "Quiet enough," Prewitt said, which was the policeman's version of what Ruddock had said in the yard about the weather, a kind of greeting more than a report. "Quiet enough," Albert agreed, mists coming up thick by the Angel. "Always does this time of year." Prewitt stamped his feet once against the cold, though it was not yet truly cold, only that damp autumn chill that got into a standing man's boots before it got anywhere else. "Saw your boy Saturday last with the top your father-in-law give him, spinning it right along the gutter outside the baker's. He'll wear a groove in the pavement at this rate. Good lad, though." Prewitt nodded, as if that settled some private matter, and touched his own helmet and moved off into the thickening dark to continue his own circuit, and Albert went on to continue his. The two of them like a pair of slow stars in their separate orbits, crossing paths at the same corner most nights, and going on. By the time he reached the coffee stall on the corner by the Angel, some 35 lamps into his round, full dark had properly come down, and the mist with it, softening every gas flame into a small, blurred halo, and turning the ordinary shop fronts and railings and chimney pots of Islington into something gentler, something that seemed, in this light, to be dissolving very slowly and very peacefully at its edges. Peggotty, no one now living, knew if that was truly his name, or a name some wit had hung on him 30 years back that had simply stuck, had his stall set up as he did every night, the urn on it sending up its own small cloud of steam into the mist, the smell of coffee and hot pie crust carrying a good 20 yards down the street to meet a man before he arrived. "Evening, Finch. Cold enough for you?" "Warm enough yet." Albert set his pole against the stall, leaning it careful so the small flame at its tip cleared the striped awning, and took the cup Peggotty passed him without being asked, strong and sweetened, the china chipped at the rim in a place worn smooth by 10,000 other lips before his own. He drank it standing, in no hurry, the warmth of it spreading down through his chest, and ate a penny pie that was mostly potato and gravy, and none the worse for that, the pastry a little burnt at one edge in a way he had come to think of as Peggotty's particular signature. Ruddock came by while he stood there, having started his own beat from the far end and worked his way round, and the two men stood a few minutes together at the stall, saying not very much, the comfortable not very much of men who had stood at this same corner on some 1,000 other nights and found each other's company sufficient without needing to fill it with talk. A late omnibus went by, lit up inside, half empty, its horses' hoofs loud and then fading. Somewhere off toward the city, a great clock struck the half-hour, faint and deep, and closer by. St. Mary's answered it a few seconds after, the two bells not quite together. The small, ordinary discord of it, something Albert had heard so many 100 times that he no longer heard it as two bells at all, but as one soft, doubled sound, a kind of punctuation the night put under itself every half-hour without fail. "Barlow's new man lost his way Tuesday," Ruddock said eventually, working the last of his own pie round his mouth. "Ended up down by the basin asking a bargeman which way was north." "Give him a month," Albert said. "Any man finds his feet in a month, or he don't stay." "You found yours quicker." "Had Yardley walking behind me the first fortnight, cursing every time I missed a lamp. Learns a man quick, that does." They both smiled at it, the old joke worn as smooth as the cup's chipped rim, and then Ruddock knocked his own cup back and settled his coat and went on toward his own remaining lamps. And Albert, a few minutes after, did the same, leaving a penny on the stall's worn counter and taking up his pole and walking on into the mist with the coffee's warmth still sitting pleasant in his chest. The second half of his round ran up along the newer streets past Duncan Terrace proper, where the houses were a little grander and set back a little further, iron railings enclosing small strips of garden, gone to leaf mold this time of year, and here the work went a touch slower, the lamps set further apart, the standards themselves taller, in places where the vestry had thought a better class of street deserved a better reach of light. He knew every one of them the way another man might know the furniture of his own front room. This one that always caught a half-second slow, its valve a little stiff since the frost 2 winters back, and never quite right after. This one by the corner where a fall of ivy had crept up the standard's foot, and which he trimmed back himself each autumn with his own pocket-knife, rather than wait on the vestry's gardener. This one outside the widow Pargeter's house, where a light always burned late in the front parlor window, and where, if he was passing at the right moment, he sometimes saw her shape cross behind the curtain, and touched his cap to it out of a habit he could not have explained to anyone who asked. By 8 o'clock, or near enough as the church bells could tell him, he had come to the last lamp of the outward round at the top of Duncan Terrace, where the street gave way to a run of newer buildings still going up, hoardings and scaffold poles standing pale in the mist like the ribs of some great stranded animal. He lit it, the 82nd, though he did not count it as such, and stood a moment with the pole resting easy across his shoulder, looking back down the long chain of lights he had made, each one small and steady and exactly like the last, receding away from him through the mist toward the angel and the city beyond, and felt the particular satisfaction that came at the end of the lighting, a job done clean and entire, before the second and quieter half of his night's work properly began. There was no rushing home to bed once the lighting was finished, though a stranger to the trade might have supposed there was. The lamps needed watching through the long hours after, for a mantle could fail, a jet blow out in a gust off the canal. A boy with more mischief in him than sense could climb a standard on a dare and leave a lamp dark for some other man's ill luck to find. And it fell to the same hand that had lit a beat to walk it again and again through the night, setting right whatever the night undid. So Albert turned and began the round once more, back the way he had come, but slower now, unburdened of the need to reach each post before dusk caught him, free simply to walk and watch and let the city do as it pleased around him. The mist had thickened further while he worked, not into fog proper, nothing that troubled the eye or throat, but into a soft, deepening haze that took the hard edges off everything and turned each lamp into its own small private country of light. A circle of gold, perhaps 10 feet across, in which the wet pavement shone, and the railings threw long soft shadows, and beyond which the street simply ceased to exist until the next such circle began. Walking from one to the next was like walking from room to room of some enormous house with no ceiling and no walls, only these scattered chambers of light strung along the dark, and Albert had come, over 11 years, to love this passage between them best of all the parts of his work. The moment of stepping out of one lamp's warm reach into the cool gray between, knowing the next waited a certain fixed number of paces on, familiar as a room he could have crossed with his eyes shut. Colebrook Row lay hushed now, most of its windows gone dark or down to a single low light behind drawn curtains, and Mrs. Adderley's cat had left its gate-post for whatever warmer errand occupied a cat at this hour, though Albert found, without quite meaning to, that he looked for it out of habit as he passed. A church clock somewhere toward Canonbury struck 10, and St. Mary's took it up a beat behind, the two of them out of step as always, and somewhere further off a dog answered the bells with 3 short barks, and then thought better of it. He met Prewitt again near midnight, the constable working the same slow, patient circuit he had been on hours before, and they stood together a few minutes in the lee of a doorway out of the thin drift of mist that had begun to settle as a fine beating damp on wool and brass alike. "Rum sort of night," Prewitt said, meaning nothing more by it than that the mist made the gaslight pretty and the street unusually still, the ordinary traffic of costers and errand boys and omnibuses long since gone to bed. "You'd think the whole of London had turned in." "Most of it has." Albert nodded up the empty length of the row, its lamps burning steady in a long, soft chain into the murk. "Leaves it to the two of us and the milkman this time of night. And whoever's minding the widow Pargeter's fire." Prewitt tipped his head toward the one lit window down the row, the same Albert had noticed himself an hour before. "Burns half the night, that one does. Ever wonder at it?" "Not my business to wonder," Albert said, though he had in fact wondered more than once, in an idle, unworried way, the sort of wondering a man does about the small, fixed features of his own round without ever needing an answer. Prewitt laughed a little at that softly, so as not to carry in the stillness, and the two of them parted again, each back to his own slow orbit. The deep hours after midnight had a texture all their own that Albert had never found the words to give Nell, though he had tried early in their marriage, lying beside her in the gray of a Sunday afternoon with the day's sleep still owed to him. It was not loneliness, whatever a stranger might suppose, looking at one man walking dark streets alone through the small hours. It was something nearer to the quiet of a church on a weekday, a stillness with its own kind of company in it, the lamps themselves keeping him fellowship, each one a small steady presence he had made and was now minding, the way a shepherd minds a flock he need not drive, only watch over. He walked, and the city breathed slowly around him. A scullery window lit somewhere, someone up, nursing a fretful baby or a late piece of work. A cat crossing a road with the unhurried privilege of an animal that owned the hour. The far-off rumble of a goods train somewhere down toward the river, carrying on its own night's business quite separate from his. Twice in the small hours he found a lamp gone dark and set it right, once at the corner by Duncan Street, where the mantle had simply burned through its evening's worth and needed the small, deft replacement he carried a spare of in the canvas satchel slung under his coat, his fingers finding the fitting by feel in the dark. practiced enough now that he scarcely needed the small storm lantern he carried for such close work. And once further up, where nothing was wrong with the lamp at all save that some restless spirit, boy or drunkard, had climbed the standard and turned the tap half shut before losing his nerve or his interest, and Albert set it right again with no more than a shake of his head and a thought not unkind for whatever boy might have been, remembering his own father's stories of worse mischief managed in his own boyhood. Somewhere past one, he found himself back near the depot end of his beat and allowed himself, as the men generally did once or twice through a long night, a few minutes' rest in the recessed doorway of the shut ironmonger's. Out of the mist, his pole leaned beside him, his back against the cool brick, still holding some ghost of the day's warmth. He was not tired in the way a man is tired after digging or hauling. The round was long but not violent work, more a matter of steady walking than of strain. But there was a particular ache that settled into the calves and the small of the back after so many hours afoot, and he let himself feel it now honestly for these few stolen minutes before the round called him on again. He thought, sitting there, of Nell asleep now these several hours, the fire banked low, Sammy and Ivy top and tail in the truckle bed, the whole small household breathing evenly through a night. He was, in a sense, standing guard over without either of them knowing it, though he did not think of it in such grand terms himself, only that it pleased him in a plain, unspoken way that his working through these hours let them sleep sound through theirs. The two halves of the day fitted together like the two halves of a hinge. The bells struck 2, and then, what felt very little time after, 3, and Albert rose each time from wherever the round had brought him and touched his cap to Prewitt or to old Ruddock's lamp far off across a gap in the streets. He could tell Ruddock's beat was still lit by the particular chain of glow visible above the rooftops toward the basin, and walked on. The mist had begun by 3 to take on the faintest different quality, not yet light, nothing a stranger would have named, but a kind of readiness in the dark, the black gone a shade less black, as though the whole sky were drawing a slow breath before the business of morning. A brewer's dray creaked past somewhere on the city road, earlier than any ordinary traffic, and not long after, faint but unmistakable, came the particular rattle and clop that Albert's ear had long since learned to name before his eye ever confirmed it. A milk cart, working its slow round 2 streets over, the milkman's call floating thin and small through the mist, the very first true sound of the morning trade beginning somewhere out past the edge of Albert's own quiet kingdom of lamps. He straightened where he stood, feeling the ache in his back settle into something more purposeful, and looked up the length of Duncan Terrace to where his first lamp of the evening still burned steady above the chapel wall, and understood, the way he understood these things now without needing to consult any watch, that his night was drawing toward its own particular close, and that it was very nearly time to begin putting out, one by one, everything he had spent the evening lighting. He did not begin at once, for the sky at 3:30 still held more night in it than morning, and a lamp put out too early left some poor soul stumbling the last dark stretch home from a night shift or a sick bed with no light to see by, and that was a thing no lamplighter worth his wage would do. He waited instead, walking the beat a last slow time simply to be sure of it, until the gray came up properly in the east beyond the rooftops, a colorless color that was not yet blue and not yet gold, only a lightening, a thinning of the dark the way tea thins when the water's poured too soon on too few leaves. By 4, the sparrows had begun in the plane trees along Colebrook Row, a thin scattered chirping that gathered strength minute by minute, and by 20 past, a blackbird somewhere had begun to sing in earnest, full-throated, indifferent to the hour, the first properly musical sound the street had offered all night. He turned the pole in his hands now for its other purpose, the small hook near the tip that all the evening had ridden idle, and started back along the beat the way he had first walked it some 12 hours before, only now undoing rather than doing, each lamp reached and the hook found, and the small definite twist that shut the gas away, the mantle's glow shrinking and guttering and going out with a soft final breath, leaving only the standard's black shape against a sky no longer quite dark enough to need it. There was a melancholy in it, a little, extinguishing what he had lit with such care, but it was a gentle melancholy, worn comfortable with use, no different really from banking a fire of an evening, knowing it would be built again, knowing the going out was only ever half of a pair with the lighting, the two of them fitted together the same as his own day was fitted to his own night. The city was waking now in earnest around him, and this, too, he had come to love almost as much as the dusk hours, though in an altogether different key. Where the evening round had been a going out into stillness, the morning round was a going out into a slow gathering noise, the two directions of the same walk somehow entirely different countries. A window went up somewhere, and a woman shook a mat out into the gray light. A baker's boy went by at a trot with his basket, whistling, the warm, yeasty smell of the first batch trailing after him strong enough that Albert's stomach, empty since Peggotty's pie some 8 hours gone, gave a small definite growl of its own opinion on the matter. The milk cart he had heard at a distance in the small hours now came properly into view at the top of Duncan Terrace. The carter, calling his round in the particular flat singing cry that Albert had heard so many 100 mornings, he no longer heard the words in it at all, only the shape of the sound, and behind it, area doors beginning to open one by one, cans held out, a small scattered conversation of good mornings passing up and down the street. He put out the lamp by the widow Pargeter's house, and saw that her parlor window too had gone dark at last, the long vigil of whatever kept her sitting up finally given over to sleep. And he thought, as he had thought before without needing an answer, that perhaps she watched the last of his lamps go out each morning the same way he watched her window, two small habits keeping time with each other across a street without either party ever remarking on it. Ruddock's chain of lights, visible above the rooftops toward the basin, was going out now, too, post by post, the two men's mornings running in a rough, unspoken parallel the way their evenings had. And somewhere past the top of the terrace, Albert caught sight of him properly for the first time since the coffee stall. A dark, small figure against the paling sky, lifting his pole to the last lamp on his own beat, and then lowering it and lifting a hand in a wave that needed no words to carry its meaning across the distance. Albert lifted his own hand back. By the time he reached the last lamp of his own round, the one by the chapel wall where his night had begun some 12 hours before, the sky had come up properly into a soft, washed gray gold, the mist thinning now under the strengthening light into mere haze, and the street had filled with the ordinary early business of a working morning. A coalman's cart, a knife-grinder's barrow trundling somewhere out of sight with its particular rhythmic squeak, two boys running somewhere with the unaccountable energy of boys at any hour, a church bell somewhere striking 5, and then closer, St. Mary's answering it. Still out of step, still after everything, the same small doubled sound that had marked every half hour of his walking since dusk. He put out the last lamp, the hook finding the valve by the same long habit that had lit it hours before, and stood a moment in the gray morning light, with the pole resting easy across his shoulder, and looked back down the length of the terrace at a street gone dark again, in an altogether different way than it had been dark at dusk. Not a waiting dark now, but a spent one, a dark with the whole business of the day already stirring up underneath it, carts and doorsteps and chimney smoke beginning to thicken against a sky no lamp was needed to answer any longer. The walk back to the depot took him past streets properly busy now, a very different London than the one he had walked through in the small hours. And Albert found, as he generally did at this stage of the round, a certain pleasant strangeness in being awake and abroad among all these people just beginning their own days, most of whom would never know, walking past a dark lamp-post at 9 in the morning, that a man's whole night's work had gone into its now invisible service. A postman crossed his path with his sack over his shoulder and touched his cap, taking Albert for some early tradesman like himself, which in a sense he was. A milk cart's carter called out a cheerful word about the mist clearing, and Albert agreed that it was, and neither man broke stride. At the depot, the yard was busy with the returning day shift of men, poles going back into their rack in a thin, leafless copse, the reverse of how they'd left it, taper cans handed in to be refilled, coats shed and hung, old Hobden taking each man's name again at the ledger, with the same lack of ceremony he'd shown the evening before. Ruddock was there ahead of him, working the stiffness out of one shoulder with the flat of his hand. "Quiet night," Ruddock said, which was as much report as any of them ever gave, the trade not running to great tales, most nights being, happily, much like the last. "Quiet enough," Albert agreed, hanging his own coat, feeling the day's proper tiredness settle into him now that the coat's familiar weight was off his shoulders, as though the coat itself had been carrying some of the work and only now handed the whole of it over to his own back. "Barlow's new man find his feet yet?" "Give him a fortnight," Ruddock said, which was his answer to most things, and the two men parted at the gate with no more ceremony than they'd met with. Ruddock toward his own lodgings, somewhere past the basin, Albert back the way he'd come the evening before, along the city road, now loud with the day's first proper traffic, drays and omnibuses and a crossing sweeper already at work outside the bank, the whole street smelling of horse and coal smoke, and faintly, from a coffee-house door propped open, of bacon frying, a smell that made the walk home feel considerably longer than the walk out had felt some 12 hours before. Wenlock Row was stirring when he reached it, doors open, a girl scrubbing a step 2 houses down, and his own front door gave under his hand with the particular give it always had, swollen a little in its frame from some old damp that never quite dried out. The kitchen was warm and smelled of new bread, and Nell was up already, as she always was by the time he came in, though she would not properly be dressed for another hour yet, moving about the small room in her wrapper with her hair still loose down her back, and she turned when the door went and gave him again that particular smile she kept for this hour, the mirror image of the one she'd given him the afternoon before. "There's tea?" she said, which was always the first thing said in that kitchen at either end of his working day. "And I've a bit of bacon if you want it before you're down." He ate at the table in his shirt sleeves, the coat already shed and hung, the boots off, his feet in their socks stretched gratefully toward the fire Nell had built up new against the morning chill, and told her, in the few plain words he generally gave it, that it had been a quiet night, mist thick but pretty with it, Ruddock complaining of nothing much, Prewitt asking after Sammy's spinning top. She listened the way she always listened, with half her attention on the fire in the kettle and the day's first chores already beginning around them both. And it did not trouble either of them that his account was thin, for the thinness of it was itself the good news it always was. No trouble on the beat, no lamp gone dark past mending, nothing amiss in the small kingdom he'd walked all night to keep alight, and then, in its proper hour, dark again. Sammy came down while he ate, still half in sleep, and leaned against his father's shoulder the way Ivy had leaned the afternoon before, and Albert let him, eating one-handed round the boy's weight, and did not send him back up, for there was a particular sleepy sweetness in a child not yet properly awake that he never tired of, coming as it did at the 1 hour of the day when his own tiredness and his children's waking crossed paths and briefly matched. By 7 he had climbed the narrow stair, each tread creaking its own particular note under his weight, the reverse direction from the evening before, and drawn the curtain against a sun now climbing properly into a pale-washed sky. The ordinary daylight world going on to its own business below the window, cartwheels, a hawker's cry, somewhere the thin clang of a dustman's bell. He undressed slowly, the day's accumulated ache settling into his shoulders and the small of his back, now that there was nothing left to hold it at bay, and lay down at last into a bed still faintly warm from Nell's own leaving of it, the sheets smelling of soap, and underneath that, very faintly, of himself, of the night's mist and coal smoke and gas that clung about a lamplighter's skin, no matter how thoroughly the day's washing tried to scrub it away. The street noise came muffled through the curtain, softened by distance and by his own gathering drowsiness, into something almost gentle. A cart's wheels, a voice calling something 2 doors down, the ordinary small business of a morning going forward without him, now that his own part in it was done. He thought, in the loose, unfastened way a man thinks just before sleep takes him, of the chapel wall lamp standing dark now in the daylight, waiting out its own long hours until dusk should call him back to it, of Ruddock, somewhere in his own bed past the basin, settling the same way into the same kind of sleep, of the widow Pargeter's window, dark now like his own would soon be, of 82 lamps strung across a quiet corner of Islington, none of them burning, all of them simply waiting, patient as the pole leaned in its corner downstairs for the evening to come round again and call them, and him, back to their small steady work. The sounds of the street grew fainter, or he grew further from them, the two amounting in the end to the same drowsy distance, and somewhere in the soft gray space between the last clear thought and the first true dream, Albert Finch let go of the waking day entirely and slept.